Steve Marley at the History Bards podcast. Thank you for joining us today. We have the great privilege of welcoming Mike Brown to the show today, and everybody knows his author name is T. Mike Brown, and he is the author of The Last Laird of Sapelo, and we're going to talk about that because it's really fascinating history for anybody who has never visited the Georgia coast. There is so much great historical facts there that can just turn into like numerous books. And so we're thrilled to have you on the show today, Mike.
Thank you, Dee. It's good to see you again, and glad to be able to participate with the historical novel group and the History Bards podcast. It's great. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And so we're kind of going to get really into this. So we want you to tell our listeners a little bit about you and how you got on this journey of becoming a historical fiction writer.
Ooh. Kind of like my main character in my first book. There was a point in my life where, I had been in corporate world, and I'd gone back to school and got some degree work done after my youngest son went off to college. And that's when I had left the corporate world. And while I was going through the getting some additional degree work done, my wife and I were trying to decide what we wanted to do and whatnot. And it ended up, by circumstances, I ended up in the classroom getting to do what I love the most. Two things. One is I ended up coaching football, which was kind of like a bucket list. I raised two boys that went off to college, and I got to do a lot of that voluntarily, but I actually got paid for it, doing it for about 6-7 years. But I was also the very typical high school football coach in the classroom, and I was the history teacher, which is my love. I've always enjoyed history. It's something even when I traveled in corporate years, I read a lot of history books. So it was an opportunity for me to get that passion back. And when I finally decided I was getting too old to be running around with a bunch of high school kids, I retired to outside of Noonan, Georgia. And my wife at that point said, look, why don't you start writing stories that your grandkids would enjoy, and that to leave a legacy. So, long story short, I said, okay. So she gave me permission to retire early. And I invested a lot of time and money and effort to understand about writing novels. And I began writing, what became my Shiloh mystery series. My first book got very lucky. I had a great writing coach who's now my longtime editor, who helped me to understand the novel writing, process and the story arcs and things of that nature. And but I ended up always loving to insert history into those stories, which are just very contemporary mystery and suspense, small town stories. And I ended up stumbling into what now is my latest book, The Last Laird of Sapelo, when I was looking for a new venue for my main characters in the series. And when I went to Darien, Georgia, knowing it was that small town on the Georgia coast, all of a sudden I learned about its fabulous history.
Yes.
And I got invited to go over to Sapelo Island, which is a ferry-only accessible island, remote island, kind of like Cumberland, but less known even than Cumberland.
Right.
And when I went over there, my tour guide ended up being a Geechee descendant. For those that don't know what that means, it means that, in his ancestry, he's related through blood with some of the original enslaved workers that had been on Sapelo during the antebellum period, predominantly with the Spalding family. When I left the island that day, he left some impressions on me that there was something unique about that history. And it wasn't your typical, and I'm going to say this carefully, but Harriet Beecher Stowe kind of story.
Exactly.
And there was a fond relationship with the Geechee descendants on Sapelo, and why they have fought to keep their community. So I ended up reading some history books that were provided to me by the owner of the bed and breakfast there in Darien. And he said, you probably want to see if there's something in here that you might want to consider writing about. So I got up every morning about 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, snuck down to the library in this beautiful home, and went perusing through all of the history books. And I went into the Spalding family history and stumbled across the story of Colonel Randolph Spalding, the youngest son of Georgia's famous Thomas Spalding, who started the plantation holdings on Sapelo. And it was a tragic story. And I read things that made him sound like he was a bad guy. But then I started researching and realized, no, he wasn't a bad guy. He was misunderstood. But historically, he did some wonderful things similar to his father. So I decided I was going to write the story of Colonel Randolph Spalding to cast an awareness, a spotlight on the background of what happened on Sapelo Island, who brought the original Geechee workers onto the island, how that was done so uniquely that actually Sapelo earned a very derisive name by the other plantation owners up and down the coast, because they were jealous of Thomas Spalding's success, and then ultimately Randolph's. And I started to say, wait a minute, there's a different story here. And I've always been a history person that says history matters. And I've always believed, with my own upbringing, that what we get taught in the schools is kind of filtered for purposes.
Yes.
And it doesn't tell you the whole truth.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write a story that will leave people wanting to know more. And that's where I took off, and where I started researching the Randolph Spalding story.
So can you kind of give us like a little preview of like what the book is actually about, like the storyline?
Yeah. In a thumbnail is, in 1850, Thomas Spalding, the patriarch of the Spalding family on Sapelo, was also very politically connected. As a matter of fact, he was in Congress with Thomas Jefferson in the early 1800s. He built his famous mansion on Sapelo Island after Monticello, Jefferson's mansion. But in the state of Georgia in 1850, there was a crisis that was happening that ended up being what's called the Compromise of 1850 nationally, where the South was actually threatening to secede then.
Yeah.
The funny story is, as one of those Paul Harvey things, it was Thomas Spalding who got elected to be the head of the secession committee for the state of Georgia in Milledgeville in 1850. And as the president of that commission, he was able to be the casting vote to stop Georgia from seceding in 1850, which created a rivalry between South Carolina and Georgia for the next decade. Move forward, Thomas Spalding dies the following year, and by circumstances and the way that Thomas Spalding's will was written, Randolph Spalding becomes the de facto last laird of Sapelo. He is now the lord and master of the entire island in the following decade, leading up to 1860. The difference is that Randolph was more of a he enjoyed drinking. His dad had, abstained from drinking. His dad didn't like music except for the pipes from the Scottish Highlands. Randolph would go socializing and dancing with his wife and go to up and down the coast. Randolph liked to gamble. He bet on horse races and things of that nature, which would have turned his father upside down. But anyway, Randolph becomes equally successful on Sapelo with the plantation, and his relationship with his Geechee workers continues the legacy that his father built. And in 1860, Georgia has the question of secession again. Randolph, who is also a representative from McIntosh County in Milledgeville, attempts to do what his father did, but fails. The tide had already turned against anybody trying to stop this secession. Randolph goes back, resigns from the Georgia Congress and comes back to McIntosh County. He accepts a commission in the Georgia militia, and this is how the story's beginning. And he's now facing the reality that he has to protect the lands and the lives and the legacy of his family. And that's his first priority. But he's also a patriot of Georgia, so he accepts his commission in the Georgia militia as a colonel. And he is now caught up in trying to find a way to help Georgia maneuver through the threat of war coming.
Yeah.
You know, in the early stages, nobody knew what the context of the war was going to be like.
Yeah.
Kind of like the famous Gone with the Wind opening line, you know, it'll be over with in a few weeks.
Yeah.
But the blockade, the Union blockade was sailing southward. War was imminent. Randolph was trying to get the final harvest in 1861 because cotton was the gold in the South.
Yeah.
And at the same time, he has now been sent back to Sapelo by Robert E. Lee and General Lawton, who is the head of the Georgia militia, to supervise troops coming onto Sapelo. And he said, hey, you know Sapelo, you could help us get, the situation. Unfortunately, what ended up surprising Randolph, and this is all historically accurate, is in those days, the militias elected their officers, the men on the ranks. And there was some conflict with the two leading candidates to who had been the regimental commander. And the men finally turned around and said, we're going to opt to elect Colonel Randolph Spalding because he knows Sapelo Island. He's going to be a better person to work with because, he's going to help, he knows the land. These other guys are just in it for glory and all that other stuff. So Randolph wakes up one morning and finds out that he's been elected the regimental commander of what would become the 29th Regiment in the Georgia Militia. And so what he's faced with, and in the story that plays out, and I won't, go too much further, but
yeah, don't.
yeah, he's faced with the challenges of finalizing that last harvest with his roughly 400 workers on the island working, night and day to finish the crop so they can all be evacuated inland to a plantation that Randolph is arranging to lease that's outside of Milledgeville. And while that's happening, 400 troops show up on Sapelo. And Randolph is caught trying to keep these young militiamen over on the coastline away from the workers because he says only trouble can come from it. Yeah. And needless to say, the story ends up with some tragic racial violence that shows up in the story that Randolph gets consumed by. So that's where the story goes. And ultimately, he ends up having to make a choice of justice or doing what was right for one of his workers who exacted revenge for the tragedy that took place on Sapelo. And I'll kind of leave that there.
Oh yeah, definitely. It kind of gives the listeners an idea of what the book is about, and propels them to, you need to go out and get this book. And so we kind of talked a little bit offline about what you're possibly working on next, like a sequel.
Yeah, I've had a lot of interest. This book and the story has been very compelling up and down the coast, particularly obviously in Darien, Georgia. I've obviously sold more books inside of McIntosh County than anywhere. And I've been back and forth to Darien and Sapelo Island several times now. So I've kind of started to look at more of the history. And in the story, there's a reference to the curse that is cast. And you'll have to read the story to know more about the curse, yes. But it does spill over to the Spalding survivors after the war when the family returns to Sapelo and discovers that virtually every one of the displaced Geechee workers who had gone to the Milledgeville plantation that he had leased, they all came back to Sapelo. And they claimed what Thomas Spalding had promised to their forefathers. They would never be sold off the land of Sapelo. they would always have a home on Sapelo, and that the Spalding family would always honor that by taking good care of them. So the Spalding family survivors show back up. And until almost 1895, the Spaldings are the only white family on Sapelo while they were being resettled with the roughly 400 original Geechee workers that were on the island, and now they're their descendants now going into the turn of the 19th century. But there is some questionable deaths that took place inside the Spalding family that continued after the war in the 1870s and early 1880s, and also how the Spalding bloodline died out by the turn of the 19th century, into the 20th century.
Right.
There are no Spaldings that are directly connected to Thomas Spalding left anywhere. Now there are those that have, because of the daughters who married into the Keenans and Wileys and McKinleys, there's a little bit of bloodline there, and I've met some of them, but the Spalding name itself died off with the last Spalding.
So there's
So
just
I'm
like
going to write that story
oh,
about
that's great.
carry the
That's
curse
great.
forward, so to speak.
Well, that sounds really great. There's like we talked about before, there is so much history. You can just like isolate it into one little area. Like with my book, Child of Love and Water, I focused on
Yeah.
Jekyll Island. And even with the era that I focused on, the later history, the 1900s, of
Oh
all
yeah.
the famous, billionaires that came,
Yeah.
to Jekyll, that story would be an incredible book to write. So there's so much rich history, and like you talked about, like the Scottish history, a lot of people don't know that about the Georgia coast. There's so
Oh
much
yeah.
rich Scottish history there. The Geechee culture. I got to visit St. Helena's Island in
Right.
Beaufort, and there's just so much really rich history with all of that. Was there anything really kind of obscure that you found in your research that maybe you could share with everybody?
That was obscure. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Well, there's a lot actually, because what ends up happening, um, gosh, the Reconstruction period on Sapelo, there was a lot that took place. And one of the things that is kind of interesting that I found about was after the war, and all of the Sapelo original workers returned, that are now free,
Yeah.
and they're getting settled back in Sapelo, and the homes that the only homes they ever knew. Other now freed slaves figured, hey, Sapelo must be a really good place to go. So they tried to go to Sapelo. But what do you think the Geechee descendants said?
Yeah.
This is
No.
our land.
Right.
So there was some bitter times there on the island for the initial period. And there's a gentleman by the name of Tunis Campbell, who was the freeman's, I'm trying to remember the proper title for him, but he was like the overseer from the federal government. But he was an African American free man who was sent by the federal government to McIntosh County to oversee the Reconstruction and make sure that the slaves were given, or the released, the new released freed black slaves were being treated properly. Well, come to find out, there was a lot of corruption in all of that
Oh, of
too.
course. Yes, there was.
And he ends up standing trial and gets convicted. And by one of the members that's mentioned in the book of Last Laird of Sapelo, sat on the trial of that. Yeah, it's there's a lot of history there. What's
So
funny
much.
is, and it's like Jekyll, there's a lot of older history in Jekyll and St. Simon Island. A lot of people don't know about.
Right. You're right about
Everybody
that.
knows the more 20th century side of it.
Yes. Yes.
And on Sapelo, gosh, I mean, in 1912, Howard Coffin buys the island, and he was one of those industrial guys that was one of the chief partners of the Hudson Motor Company.
Yeah.
And he has rebuilt what was South End, the big house mansion, as best as he could, because it had been destroyed during the war. And but he went bankrupt in Depression. So who comes swooping in to be the great hero for Sapelo is R.J. Reynolds Jr., who is from the tobacco
Yes.
family. Except he never worked in the industry, in the tobacco factory since he was a teenager working in a warehouse. But he took his money and he parlayed it in New York City. He hobnobbed with the famous actresses in the movie industry. But he buys Sapelo on pennies on the dollar, and he turns the South End Big House into his playhouse. Now he's on his fourth wife by the time he gets to Sapelo. And so needless to say, there's a lot of there could be a third book that
Oh,
would be
yes,
done right.
for sure.
I was going to do that first, but I figured there might be somebody still living that would sue the hell out of me.
Probably.
But
Yeah.
I've been on the island now enough to know that I think it would be safe to write some stories about R.J. Reynolds' reputation on the island, and
Well,
see how that.
that's so fascinating. Thank you, Mike, so much for being on the show today. We really do appreciate it. And please tell our listeners about where they can go to find your books, like your website and
Yeah. The easiest way is if you go to tmbrownauthor.com, and that's just simply my initials, tmbrownauthor.com. The minute you get there, you'll see links to The Last Lair to Sapelo so that you can buy it on wherever, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, wherever, books are sold. Also, you'll find links to the Shiloh Mystery Series, which are my other 3 books. Sanctuary was the first. It still is the number 1 seller in my book line, so I'm very tickled to death about that.
I'm
it's
sure.
the last book where everybody was doing reviews. I don't know what happened to COVID. COVID turned off a lot of reviewers.
It did. It definitely did.
Yeah, Sanctuary got some national recognition, but there's the other 2 books in the series, Testament and Purgatory. They're fun reads. For those that would know this, the best review I ever got was John Grisham meets Jan Karen.
Wow.
If you don't know about Jan Karen, Google her.
Yeah.
But everybody should know John Grisham.
Oh, yes.
That was the most flattering review I've ever received.
Absolutely, it is.
And it's the best way to describe the series. So.
Well, that sounds great, Mike. And so we'll definitely put that link up on our description for the podcast, and we'll have it on the screen so that people can go immediately to your website and check out your books. We really do, again, appreciate you being on the show today.
Well, I look forward to coming down and catching up with you in a couple of events back and forth. Now that I only live 30 minutes up the road from you, and
that's right,
in Milledgeville now.
Yeah.
So I'm still exploring this area, and I love it. So thank you again, Dee, very much. And anything I can do for y'all, you let me know.
I sure will. Thank you again. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for listening today. This is Dee Marley with the History Bards podcast. And don't forget, keep making history and keep listening.